Sometimes, it's not that you're difficult. It's just that no one really gets you. You speak from the heart. You try to be honest, real, unfiltered. But they just blink, change the subject, crack a joke to lighten the mood. Suddenly, your truth becomes a disruption, something that doesn't belong in their carefully curated comfort zone. And so you hesitate, not because you're unsure of yourself, but because you've learned what happens when you say what you really mean. The silence, the awkward glances, the way people look at you like you've broken some invisible rule. You start to wonder maybe you did. Maybe you went too far. Maybe you're too sensitive, too intense, too deep. But no, the truth is, you're not too anything. You're just awake in a world that's half asleep. And when you speak from a place of truth, it's not that people don't hear you. It's that they don't know what to do with what they hear. Most people were taught to smile, to perform, to say the right thing. You were taught to feel, and feel deeply. That's why you're tired. That's why you feel invisible in rooms full of people. Not because you're broken, but because you refuse to wear the mask long enough to be accepted. And that refusal, it costs you connection. It costs you comfort. It makes you the outsider in conversations you wish you could belong to. But it also means this: you've held on to something sacred, yourself. Look around. Most people aren't living. They're performing. They say the right things, smile at the right times, ask polite questions they don't care to hear the answers to. They post curated pieces of a life they no longer recognize. They laugh too loud at jokes that don't touch them. They celebrate milestones that mean nothing with people they don't trust, in places they don't want to be. But they keep playing the part because somewhere along the way, they were taught that survival looks like acceptance. That blending in means you're safe. So they shrink. They sand down their edges. They mute their questions. They lie about how they feel. Not because they want to, but because they've seen what happens to people who don't. The ones who speak up get called dramatic. The ones who feel deeply get labeled unstable. The ones who break the illusion get pushed out of the frame. So the world keeps spinning on a script no one remembers writing, but everyone is expected to follow. Be agreeable, be predictable, be nice, even if it kills you, especially if it kills you quietly. And when someone like you walks in, someone who refuses to pretend, someone who says what they actually mean, who doesn't filter their soul into something marketable, the system rejects you. Not because you're wrong, but because you remind them of what they gave up. You were never too intense. You were just honest before they were ready. That's the thing about being real. It's not just what you say, it's when you say it. You feel things early. You see things others haven't processed yet. You name what everyone is silently avoiding. And in a world addicted to denial, calling something by its true name is like throwing a grenade into a silent room. So they flinch. They call you dramatic. They say you're overreacting. They tell you to calm down, not because you're wrong, but because your truth arrived too soon. You speak grief, while others are still pretending everything's fine. You mention betrayal, while they're still romanticizing the story. You say, "I'm not okay," before the room even admits there's a wound. That's why they don't understand you. You're not off track. You're ahead of the curve. And being ahead is lonely, because people don't recognize truth when it first arrives. They call it uncomfortable. They call it negative. They call it you. But later, sometimes years later, they repeat what you said like it's a new revelation. They write articles about it. They put it in books. They say it saved them. And you're just sitting there, remembering the day you said it first, and they walked away. You think they don't like you because of something you said, something you did, something you failed to do. But the truth is more complicated. It's not about what you did. It's about what you reflected. See, people don't react to you. They react to the part of themselves that awakens in your presence. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the repressed self, the side of us we hide, deny, and bury. So deep we forget it exists, until someone walks in and mirrors it back at us. And that mirror, that's you, your honesty, your depth, your refusal to perform, your emotional clarity, your unwillingness to pretend. It terrifies them, not because you're wrong, but because you're showing them the mask they forgot they were wearing. You're reminding them of the parts they gave up to fit in, the pain they never processed, the grief they swallowed, the dreams they let die quietly. You walk into the room and don't play the game, and suddenly, everyone playing feels exposed. That's why they pull back. That's why they roll their eyes. That's why they change the subject, laugh a little too loudly, or label you dramatic. Because deep down, you've triggered something they don't want to feel. And in a society where suppression is survival, anyone who threatens that suppression is seen as a threat. So, they blame you. They say you're too sensitive, too deep, too serious. When really, you're just unwilling to live in a world that calls numbness normal. You've done the work. You've looked inward. You've faced the things they still run from. And in doing so, you've become dangerous. Not because of what you are, but because of what you reveal. And here's the part that stings. This didn't start last week. It didn't begin in college, or at your last job, or during that failed relationship. It started long before that. It started the first time you said something honest, and the adults in the room looked uncomfortable. The first time you cried too loudly and were told, "Stop making a scene." The first time you questioned a rule and were punished, not for being wrong, but for being inconvenient. That's when the training began. You learn that truth makes people uneasy, that emotion needs to be hidden, that asking why is dangerous. So you shrank. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You apologized for feeling too deeply. You started censoring yourself, not to protect your voice, but to protect their comfort. That wasn't emotional maturity. That was survival. And the world praised you for it. They said, "You're such a good kid." But what they really meant was, "You're easy to manage." Carl Jung understood this perfectly. He wrote that every child has a natural wholeness, a self waiting to unfold. But society doesn't raise children. It programs them, not to be authentic, but to be acceptable, not to be whole, but to be manageable. And that programming, it doesn't go away. It becomes your default. You grow up believing your real self is too much. That love is something you have to earn by being quiet, agreeable, emotionally flat. You start to fear your own truth, not because it's wrong, but because every time you spoke it, someone made you feel like it was a threat. And that fear becomes a blueprint, one you carry into every room, every relationship, every silence, until one day you stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "What do they want to hear?" But lately, something in you has started to wonder, what if I stopped asking that? What if I listened to what's been buried underneath all along? And when you finally did speak, when you dared to show a piece of who you really were, they didn't listen. They labeled, "You're too sensitive. You overthink everything. You're just being dramatic." Not because you were wrong, but because your truth made them uncomfortable. And instead of facing that discomfort, they weaponized it. They didn't have to control your voice. They just had to make you doubt it. And so, you started shrinking again. This time not out of obedience, but out of self-protection. You made yourself smaller to stay safe. You played easy to love, but deep down, you knew you weren't too sensitive. You were perceptive. You weren't overreacting. You were reacting to things they refused to see. Your pain wasn't exaggerated. It was just finally visible. And when people called you intense, what they really meant was, you feel in a way I've forgotten how to. When they called you complicated, what they meant was, you make me realize how shallow I've become. These labels weren't reflections of who you are. They were reflections of what they feared. Because when someone's entire identity is built on pretending, your honesty becomes a threat. And threats must be neutralized, not with force, but with silence, with shame, with the slow erosion of your confidence, one dismissive comment at a time, until one day you look in the mirror and wonder when exactly you stopped trusting your own voice. But here's the truth. It was never your voice that was the problem. It was their inability to hear it without being reminded of what they buried in themselves. You keep thinking you're the problem, that if you could just be less sensitive, less intense, less emotional, you'd finally belong. But what if it's not you? What if the problem is the system? A system that was never designed for people like you. Not for the feelers, not for the truth tellers, not for the ones who question what everyone else just accepts. Think about it. From the moment you enter school, you're taught to raise your hand for permission, to sit still, to memorize, to obey, not to think, not to feel, not to challenge. Creative kids get told to focus. Sensitive kids get told to toughen up. Philosophical kids get told to stop asking so many questions. The goal isn't to help you become yourself. It's to make you easier to manage. And when you enter adulthood, it doesn't change. Jobs reward you for compliance. Relationships reward you for being easy. Social media rewards you for being palatable. The system doesn't want your truth. It wants your performance, your curated smile, your filtered feelings, your silence in the face of injustice. You weren't rejected because you failed. You were rejected because you refused to play the role. Because here's the secret they never told you. This world isn't built for wholeness. It's built for function, for profit, for predictability. And when your truth disrupts that, when your soul doesn't fit into the mold, the system doesn't say, let's change the mold. It says, you're broken, but you're not broken. You're just real in a world that's allergic to real. And the longer you keep trying to shrink to fit it, the more you betray the very thing that makes you alive. You've been told you're too much your whole life. Too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, too deep. But maybe you were never too much. Maybe everyone else was just too asleep, because what they called too emotional was just you refusing to go numb. What they called too intense was just you refusing to perform small talk when the world is on fire. What they called too deep was just you refusing to live on the surface of your own existence. You remember the moment a friend rolled their eyes and said, "God, you're so dramatic," and you just stood there, silent. Not because they were right, but because you already knew arguing wouldn't make them see. They tried to shrink you, not because you were wrong, but because your full self made them question their half-lived lives. And people will do anything to not feel the shame of their own denial. So, they project it. They name you the problem, because the alternative, facing themselves, would collapse the entire lie they're living. But here's what they don't know. You survived it. You carried the labels. You wore the shame. You internalized the noise. And you still came back to yourself. Slowly, quietly, fiercely. Because there's a part of you they couldn't touch. A core, untamed, untouched by their projections, still pulsing with truth. And now, that part is waking up. It doesn't want to hide anymore. It doesn't want to shrink or edit itself to be palatable. It doesn't want to apologize for existing in full volume. You were never too much. You were just awake in a world that punishes anything that can't be sedated. There's a moment after the anger fades, after the pain settles, where something quieter begins to rise. It's not rage. It's not revenge. It's something deeper, something older, awakening. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that changes how you breathe, how you walk into rooms, how you look at your own reflection. You stop apologizing, not because you want to be defiant, but because you finally understand that your existence doesn't need permission. You start saying less, but meaning more. You start listening to the small voice you silenced for years, and it doesn't shout. It just says, there you are. You realize you can't go back, not to pretending, not to shrinking, not to smiling through your own erasure. You catch yourself hovering over a message, the kind you used to answer instantly, just to keep the peace. But now, your hand pauses, and you don't send it. The cost is too high now. Once you've touched truth, illusion feels unbearable. You look around and see it everywhere. In the forced laughter, the empty conversations, the need to be liked, even if it means being hollow. And you feel it, that quiet refusal in your chest, the one that says, I can't do this anymore. You're not better than anyone, but you are different now. Not louder, just clearer. You're awake. And once you're awake, going back to sleep isn't peace. It's betrayal. Sure, even after everything, you still try to belong. You still walk into rooms hoping someone might see the real you. You still reply to messages. You still show up to dinners, hoping maybe this time the conversation will go beneath the surface. But something's changed. It's not just that you're different. It's that the mask doesn't fit anymore. You can't laugh at things that aren't funny. You can't fake interest in conversations that feel like cardboard. You can't say, I'm fine, without hearing the echo of a lie in your own voice. You watch others dance inside the script, and part of you still envies them. The ease, the flow, the simplicity of fitting in. But every time you try to step back into that role, something inside you freezes. Not because you don't want connection, but because you can't unsee what you've seen. You've tasted truth. You've heard your own voice. You've felt what it's like to live without performing. And now the performance feels unbearable. So you sit in rooms you used to blend into, and you feel like a ghost. Not because you're invisible, but because no one is really looking. They see your smile. They hear your polite responses, but they don't notice the part of you that's gone quiet. The part that used to try so hard to belong. That part doesn't beg anymore. It just watches, and in that silence, you realize something simple and brutal. You could make yourself small again. You could fake it. You could shrink your truth to be accepted. But you won't, because something in you has changed forever. Maybe the world doesn't understand you. Maybe it never truly did. But that doesn't mean you don't belong here. It means the world is still catching up. Because what you carry, this ability to feel deeply, to see through noise, to stay awake when everyone else is asleep, it's not a flaw. It's medicine. You were never meant to numb out. You were never meant to float on the surface. You were born to go deep, to notice the cracks in the mask, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to feel what others deny. And yes, that's heavy. Yes, it's isolating, but it's also necessary, because a world that rewards numbness is starving for realness. And the ones who feel too much, they're the ones who catch what's collapsing before it falls. They sense the storm before it hits. They speak what no one else dares to say, not because it's safe, but because it's true. You've spent so long thinking your depth made you unlovable, but maybe it's the very thing that makes you essential. What if your sensitivity isn't the wound, but the doorway? What if your pain isn't the weakness, but the evidence that you're still alive in a world that's gone numb? You don't need to fix yourself. You need to honor yourself, because the world doesn't need more filters, more edits, more people who can perform happy while dying inside. It needs people like you, people who feel, people who notice, people who can't lie to themselves anymore. You've spent so long feeling like the only one who sees too much, feels too deeply, thinks too far. You walk through life like a visitor, nodding along to conversations you don't believe in, smiling at moments that feel hollow, carrying truths that feel too heavy to speak. But then, one day, it happens. You say something real, something risky, something you've learned to keep hidden. And someone doesn't flinch. They don't change the subject. They don't call you intense. They just look at you, and their eyes say, same. That moment changes everything, because now you know you're not alone. You never were. There are others like you, people who feel the weight of words before they're spoken, who get quiet, not because they're empty, but because they're full. People who've learned to hide their fire just to survive. People who are tired of pretending. People who hear a sentence and sense the pain it came from. They exist. They're just quieter than the rest. But they're out there. And when two awake souls meet, really meet, the room feels different. The masks drop. The air changes. Time slows. And for a moment, the illusion breaks. No small talk. No performance. Just, you see it too, don't you? And in that recognition, something in you exhales. The part that's been holding its breath for years. Because you don't need everyone to understand you. You just need to know that someone else sees the same cracks in the world and refuses to look away. You don't need to fix the world. You don't need to save anyone. You don't need to convince those who refuse to listen. You just need to stay awake. In a world built on noise, stillness is a revolution. In a culture addicted to pretending, truth is rebellion. And in a society that rewards numbness, feeling deeply is an act of quiet defiance. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to shout your truth to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to live honestly, to feel everything, to ask the hard questions, to stop performing. That alone changes the room. It changes the air. It changes the people around you, even if they never say a word, because presence is contagious. And when one person dares to be fully present, it gives others permission to return to themselves. You may never be applauded for it. You may never go viral for it. But somewhere, quietly, you've reminded someone what it means to be real. And in a world starving for realness, that is more than enough. Don't underestimate what you carry. Your stillness has weight. Your silence has presence. Your depth ripples. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You are meant to be felt by those who are ready. So no, you don't need to be loud. You just need to keep choosing not to fall asleep again. This isn't a manifesto. It's a reminder. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to scream your truth across a crowd that isn't listening. You just need to stay awake. Speak less. Say more. Listen for the things no one is saying. Feel for what's being hidden behind polite words and hollow smiles. Watch the ways people disappear while pretending to be present. And stay rooted in what's real, not what's trending. The world will try to pull you back into performance, into distraction, into the sleep of conformity. But you know too much now. You felt too much now. You can't unknow what you know. So here's the invitation. Walk differently. Choose presence over performance. Silence over noise. Meaning over approval. Speak when it matters. Look people in the eye. Ask better questions. Say fewer words, but make them real. Don't chase applause. Chase alignment. And if the world still doesn't get you, that's okay. You weren't made to be understood by everyone. You were made to wake up a few. And sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to fall asleep again, to remind others they don't have to either. And if this spoke to you, if something in your chest ached a little, if a part of you whispered, finally, someone put it into words, then know this. You're not broken. You're just finally real. You're not dramatic. You're just feeling what others refuse to. You're not too much. You're just not pretending anymore. And that is a gift. Not everyone will understand it, but the right ones will feel it. So, if this made you feel seen, leave a comment below. Even just one word. That's all it takes to remind someone else reading that they're not the only one either. And if you want more spaces like this, spaces that don't demand a performance, subscribe. Stay close. You don't have to explain yourself here. You don't have to shrink. You don't have to fit in. You just have to be real. And if you'd like to help keep this space alive, there's a way to support this channel in the description. But whether you give or not, whether you ever comment or share or show your face, I just want you to know, I see you. I feel you. I've been where you are. And I'm glad you're still here.